Hi, I'm Adam Pacifico, and welcome to the Leadership Enigma, a world-ranked, award-winning podcast that's insatiably curious as regards what leaders do, how they do it, and importantly, why. We'll delve into the human doing, but even deeper into the human being and the power of human-centered leadership to drive sustainable change. So whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts and disruptors, as together we will discover that success leaves clues. This is very cool, actually. This does beat the studio.
So it's a little bit different. And I think we have to sort of warn everyone, we can't see anything now. So it's a little weird, but it's nice because we can just pretend they're not there.
I can see now. But good to be here. Thanks.
So I suppose a good place to start would be maybe if you could introduce yourself, and I'll probably then do the same. I think we've got a good probably half the guests are kind of yours and half are ours. So maybe we sort of do that introduction first and talk to us a little bit about who you are and the podcast.
It's an eclectic mix of people, that's for sure. I'm Adam Pacifico, so I host the Leadership Enigma, and I do know many people, which is great, and it's incredibly flattering to see so many people here tonight. I started life as a barrister, as a trial lawyer in my professional career, so prosecuting and defending, but then an odd thing happened, and just after 4 years at the bar, I became an operational police officer with the Metropolitan Police. And I know that we've got people who have been guests who represent both those professions. And that was great fun. That was 6 years of being operational, a couple of years in uniform on the mean streets of North London in the 1990s. And then 4 years on the proactive teams, which was great fun. And that was interesting because it was for many poacher turned gamekeeper. But I learned a lot about leadership, saw some of the best of human behavior, but also unfortunately saw some of the worst of human behavior. And then there was no real plan to it. I think as opportunity knocked, I just stepped through the door. And then from there, I went back to the bar. I was without a doubt a better prosecutor, having been operational for a few years. But I think I'd been exposed to experiential, real immersive learning, whether that was in a mock courtroom. I know Selva is here. He and I are contemporaries. We kind of grew up through the profession at the same time, practicing trial skills within the mock court environment, or having petrol bombs thrown at my head in Riot City. And I think there was something very powerful about that experiential and immersive learning. And we were asked to take that into the corporate sector. And that started the career within leadership development. So business schools, Indian edtechs, boutiques, and then latterly with Heidrick and Struggles. But I think that has really been a passion now, the leadership of organizations and just the human-centered piece, which I know is the focus for today. So it's a strange background, but in many ways it's been a fun career. It's been a squiggly career.
Yeah, and now obviously we know each other because of your podcast, which is 170 episodes?
I think 168. I think Selva, who I mentioned, was the latest this week. That was episode 168. So who knew?
That's amazing. So, and that's been in the last, 2 years?
No, it's probably been about 3 years now. We ended up releasing one a week.
Yeah.
And so, I've had the odd week off, I must admit. But it's been about 168 episodes have gone out.
So for anyone who hasn't heard it, I think Adam's got some amazing episodes in there, and we're going to talk a bit about some of those. So it's actually a really fun opportunity because I've done quite a few podcasts certainly in the last year or so. And Adam's was certainly one of the most interesting I did, and probably one of the most difficult ones that I did. It was quite an emotional, for me anyway, it was quite an emotional episode. I don't know how it came across for you. And I've had some really nice feedback on that. So I suppose that's again, if anyone you can go back and listen to that, but also that's sort of very, very naturally how we met. And I think we had such a good conversation that's just been going on since. And I get the impression that's actually been the case with a lot of your guests.
I think the CEO series was almost by accident for the Leadership Enigma. And I know Chris Caldwell's here, Alexandra Altinger are here. And it was interesting. When you came in, we had a really intimate and I would say vulnerable and courageous conversation, which may have taken you by surprise. And the reason I say may have taken you by surprise was because prior to that, I'd had 3 CEOs come into the studio and used a phrase similar to, it's time to take the mask off. And they were talking now about extreme vulnerability. And I think that was something that you were very clearly evidencing when you came in, but also you were very comfortable of having that very open conversation. And we got to a point, I remember you actually saying at one point, actually, no, hang on, I'm getting a little emotional here now. And I think when that happens, I'm always really humbled by people taking the time to come in, people having very, very, I think, human being focused conversations, and sometimes telling me things which they hadn't even expected or anticipated to tell me. I remember I had Chris Grant, OBE, actually came in and we had a conversation and suddenly told me about the fact he was dealing with cancer. And that had never been the intention to come out, but he just felt that the nature of the conversation or maybe the rapport that we had. And so there were loads of clues in all of the episodes where it just kept on focusing on the human being over the human doing. And I'm always incredibly impressed by what people have achieved, and you know, that is to be applauded, but I tend to spend more time on the human being side of the human doing. And we did that with you. Let's be honest, what you've achieved is incredible. But we actually talked about some of the challenges that had led up to that.
Which actually I think is, for me, the more interesting part. You know, it's like when you take my journey, and maybe I'll introduce that in a second, but over the last 2 decades, it's sort of easy if you look backwards to see a path and everyone can kind of go, okay, that makes sense. I see how that happens. What you forget is all of the blind alleys along the way, all the things that didn't work out. But obviously those kind of, thankfully, all our mistakes get lost to time. So you know, that you from the outside, you don't see that. It just looks like from day one, it was destined to be a success. But those forks in the road, you know, they definitely were there.
Well, you've got to tell people a little bit about your story, Tim,
right? So
you were the crazy person initially. You kept on going and going and going until suddenly,
I still am.
Well, that too.
No, I think So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim. I am the CEO and founder of Vorboss. We are today a fiber business-to-business fiber provider and asset owning network in London. We're centered around providing the very best in next generation fixed connectivity to London businesses. And that's been a really interesting journey because my background is sort of engineering and computer science. I was coding since I was probably 14, 15 years old. I started the business as a software business, and then we've kind of gone through a lot of changes over the years. We got into providing connectivity in a big way, starting maybe a decade ago, and then really it was in post 2019 and 2020 when we then massively scaled the business and became an asset owner. And that's been a really interesting journey because we had, I think, around 25 people during the pandemic, at the start of the pandemic in 2020. By the end of the pandemic, we were over 250 people, and today we're sort of just under 400. But it was, I think, one of the things that enabled us to scale was that we had this amazing foundation of 15 years of figuring out how to do things right. And once you have that foundation, it's then very easy to build a structure on top of it. And I think that's a benefit we had that a lot of kind of scale up businesses don't have. I started the business in 2006, still running it. Very, very different business today. And it's a really exciting place to be in London. We probably have the incumbent sort of former monopoly of BT that probably still has something in the order of 3/4 to 80% market share, and we're probably the only player that's really gonna kind of hold their feet to the fire and challenge that huge market share. And it's been a really exciting journey for me.
See, I was interested to talk to you because, oh my God, I'm turning the tables again, aren't I? Because in many ways you were a disruptor in quite a traditional sector. But what also interested me was that you went from a dozen to 20 people to just nearly 400. That's a massive challenge for a CEO who now has to be a significant people leader. And I remember you saying to me the statistics would bear out that you were probably dealing with people who were having a significant crisis in their life at work just by the very nature of them being human beings. And we talked about that. And I think that was also fascinating to say, if you have a tribe of people who you are responsible for, there's probably a certainty that at least one or more is having a significant human challenge. But you had a thought on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was when we hit, it was like a solemn day. I start every morning, I wake up and I think about the people, right? That's what brings me to work. And and all of my team, some of whom are here, will know, and I've said it many times, we will build the fibre network. We largely have. We will be a success. We will win. I truly believe that. So actually, it's about winning in a way we can be proud of, and making sure we take care of our people along the way, and we build a legacy. And it's not about a legacy for legacy's sake, but build an organisation that can also survive. Because actually, it's very easy to be a challenger. It's actually very hard to build an organisation that has longevity, and part of that is engineering in the ability to adapt and change into the way your organisation works. But so that the people's the kind of the bit that brings you back to it. If we didn't build this, somebody else would have. Right. And I think we all at some level do struggle to be passionate about fibre. It's only so much you can really care about that, right? But I think what's actually interesting is the people. So, but 220 people, I remember when we kind of crossed that threshold, and a lot of people here will remember it. It was, for me, it was, I don't want to say solemn, but it was a very serious point, because it's a magic number. 220 in the UK is about the number of working days a year. So if you think about it, in every, as someone that ran a very small resource-constrained business for years, suddenly in one turn of the clock, you have an entire human year working year lived out in your company. And similarly, when you pass 365 people, you now have a whole calendar year lived out in every day in your business. And so, the statistics would serve that, which is that on any given day, and I've said this many times, on any given day, you probably have one person in your company that's suicidal. You probably have 10 people with a stomach ache. You probably have, 5 people who are depressed. Equally, you've got a whole bunch of people who are super happy, and somebody loses a significant family member, every week or so. So things that would happen to you once a year are happening somewhere in your business every single day. And then you scale that up, and it's terrifying, right? So you kind of, as we approach 440 people, you can sort of then say, okay, well, let's double that number now. And then you start thinking, well, that's happening kind of on my watch. That's happening in an environment I created, and one that, I started this business in a bedroom in my parents' house. So there's that, I had no vision for, I'm going to have hundreds of employees one day. And I feel super accountable for that.
And that's where the human-centered piece comes in, for sure.
But I'm not going to let you turn the tables.
Sorry. That's a force of habit, isn't it?
Yeah. So I suppose what interested me was actually a chance that I was super intrigued, because I came in, I talked to you, and I had that thing where I'm sure many people have had this. We used to have one of those conversations that I normally ask a lot of questions, and then I sort of leave the room and I'm like, well, firstly, I feel like I've been in therapy for an hour. It's exhausting. Secondly, I just had a whole ton of questions. So to start is just talk us through what got you into doing the podcast.
The pandemic? Mm-hmm. Who remembers the pandemic? We've all got short memories, haven't we? And I remember lockdown number 1 very well. I lost a parent just at the start of the pandemic, so that was a difficult time then. And then the pandemic kicked in, which we had never really experienced before, obviously. I remember someone said a phrase to me that I think is incredibly true. They said, when you press the pause button on a computer, it stops. But when you press the pause button on a human being, that's when we start to think. And I think the pandemic may have pressed the big red pause button on everybody. And everyone had a deeply personal experience, and I'm included. And I think we may have touched upon that in our conversation. And I panicked, because I thought, I can't get on planes, trains, and automobiles. I can't actually be an educator. I can't connect with people. I don't know how to learn. I don't know how to stay valuable. I don't know how to continue with a network. And I genuinely panicked. And so I watched way too many YouTube videos in the middle of the night, genuinely. And I said to my wife, I'm going to start a podcast. She said, what do you know about podcasting? And I went, not a lot. And I just tried to learn and learn and learn. And what I did was I reached out to a lot of people who were also in the pandemic, but they were very good friends with the network. And I just said to them, listen, I've just got this idea of a podcast to try and stay connected, learn, just try and create something, in some ways, just try and stop us all going kind of crazy. And all those people said yes. Before I knew it, I had 16 episodes in the tank. And in fact, Kevin O'Leary is here, who was number 1 podcast. He's a dear friend. So I remember ringing up and he just went, yeah, sure, let's do it. And I needed that, because I had no idea what I was doing. So I needed people who would trust me and say, let's just have a conversation. We were all stuck at home. And before I knew it, there were 16 episodes. I think I only realized much later, and I've talked about this more and more now, is that I had a teenager who was also struggling significantly with mental health. There's a good news story on that, is that she's now thriving in Thailand. My wife has gone there today actually to see her. But things got pretty dark and pretty bleak. And I think the podcast had become a coping mechanism as well, without me realizing it. In some ways, I had used it in order to focus on it, in order to try not to focus on some of the things that we were dealing with as a family.
Do you think it was a distraction, or do you think it was also just maybe that human connection?
I think it was, at the time, not conscious. I think it was a huge distraction. But also, I think I was looking for something, and without a doubt, now I'm understanding that the podcast is probably one of the biggest teachers for me in relation to who I am, the skill set that I have or don't have, and I'm learning all the time. So I'm genuinely humbled by every single guest that comes in, and I learn something, and I feel that there's a value to each and every conversation.
Right.
So the whole thing was, in some ways, by accident, I don't know, but it was generated predominantly by the pandemic.
So that leads me very nicely, I suppose, because I was going to really, the big question I wonder is, you have this, you know, I've managed to listen to quite a few episodes.
You're my number one listener now.
Yeah, maybe, and it's great. Like, I'm not a big podcast guy either, so it's actually quite fun to.
That's high praise then.
Yeah, I think that's like 50% of all the podcasts I listened to this year. But you're in the enviable position of having these really interesting conversations with some really, really fascinating people, and I think your guests are super diverse. So I guess, what are the themes you keep coming back to? Because I've seen some patterns, but I'm kind of curious what's going on in your head when you're navigating that, because you have, you know, it's a whirlwind, right? Like, I turned up to your studio in North London, kind of came in, we had no prep, sat down, you know, which is the best way, I think. We sat down, we had it like straight into a pretty deep conversation for just under an hour, I think.
Yeah.
And then sort of shook hands and went, that was brilliant. And you know, and off I went.
I think we even hugged at the end, actually.
Yeah, yeah. Rare for me.
Yeah, sorry, you're not a hugger, but there we go. I am. But
no, it was great.
it was an awkward hug, maybe.
It's just like, try not to like dampen your sweater at the time. Yeah. So, no, but so, and then I sort of go away and I think, actually, that's amazing, because in that hour there was so many places we could have gone, and I think on balance, what we talked about was brilliant. And I guess the question is, how are you doing that? So what are you finding yourself centering on really quickly? You get in front of somebody really, really interesting. You have an hour of their time. How's that work?
I think I have to probably look back at the training as a trial lawyer and the training as a police officer, which has led to me to being insatiably curious. I am deeply interested by people, because I've seen the great and the not so great. And we're all flawed, but we're all wonderful at the same time. And I think that curiosity has just come out. And I say to people, and some people think, I suppose maybe I'm not prepping a lot. I just have a very loose structure in my mind, and I just say, just have a conversation, you take the lead, and I'm going to follow. And I will just be curious along the way. And it served me really well for I think we've got 175 episodes in the tank. And it just seems to work. So maybe I found where all that skill set will lend itself. But I'm definitely seeing some things, without a shadow of a doubt. And the thing that has come to the surface is that of human-centered leadership. So if you said to me, what is the big differentiator? You know, I still get a chance to work with large corporations all over the world with Hydrick, which is an incredible pleasure and a privilege. But I say to people now, you know, whether I'm working in international law firms or accountancy firms or tech, whatever it might be, these organizations are filled with technically gifted people in relation to their subject matter expertise. But I tend to say now those are table stakes, because there are great, talented people in each of these law firms, in each of these professional services firms, in each of these tech firms, whatever it might be. But the differentiator, I think, time and time again, is human-centered leadership. That came out when I wrote the book in 2020, and I think that's come out in the conversations. And it's that ability to be. Do you know what? I spoke to John Amici. John Amici, I interviewed for the book, and he's come onto the show twice. John is a former NBA player. He's a psychologist here. He's the author of The Promises of Giants. And I've had really good conversations with John, and he has a very, very strong point of view. And he got me thinking, because I'm trying to understand what's the definition of leadership. It's very personal. Now, if you type that into Google, there's a problem, because you'll get 1,950,000,000 responses, which is deeply unhelpful. But he said to me, leadership is the promise of a lived experience for those around you. And that really resonated with me, because of something that was said to me by an amazing mentor who unfortunately passed away. He was a larger-than-life Floridian trial lawyer, who I was incredibly lucky to know for 4 years as a young lawyer. And when I got my first job as a young lawyer with a leadership angle to it, I told him, I was very excited, I told him, and this is before I was married, and he said, congratulations. And I never forget what he said to me. I wrote it in my book, and I always lead with it. He said, the children of the people you lead will know your name.
Mm-hmm.
He said, in what context is entirely up to you. And I always say to people, how many of you have got kids? And you might put your hand up, and I say, be honest with me, your kids know your boss's name, don't they? And people always look at their shoelaces. But it's so true. So leadership is incredibly personal. And a lot of the work we do now is helping people understand what does that mean to them as a leader, and then what is that shadow that they cast, that you cast throughout your organization? What is the lived experience that you give people around you? And that's not just in relation to the 400 or so at Vorboss, Tim, it's actually the wider stakeholder community.
Perhaps ever the optimist, I look at that the other way as well, which is, that's it's a terrifyingly huge opportunity to create massive positive impact, right?
Yep.
And I think that's something that we digress slightly, but we have kind of two main kind of promises, commitments that we make to all of our staff, and the challenge I kind of give all of our leaders, which is to never lose track of the individual. And by that I mean we don't use groups, we don't use labels, we try and optimize the organization so that everybody can actually have a unique experience. So it's not let's find one way to solve the problem. It's let's have policies that are more like 10 commandments, that give people that constitutional guidance, but allows them a lot of room for interpretation to customize and personalize the experience. And by the way, when we talk about generational stuff, that's hugely important for the incoming generations. So we have that sort of don't lose track of the individual. And then secondly, we say we want to make this the best job you ever have. Not the best job you've ever had, but that you ever have. And for me, the sort of reference or the frame for that is, I think about sitting and chatting to my granddad when I was a kid and talking to him about his career, his entire career. And there was always that sort of one job that he would gravitate towards, that with the power of hindsight at, 86 years old or whatever, he can say, that was the best thing I did. And I actually went on and did another 30 years after it, but it was that thing. That shaped me. And for me, that's this terrifying pressure that we have an organization where, we can create that for potentially a lot of people, where they go, this was where I learned my trade, or this is where I got comfortable public speaking, or this is where I learned the power of vulnerability, or this is where I learned to lead. And I look across our business and I think, we're gonna create probably hundreds and thousands of experiences. And then there are people who are going to go and open restaurants and become team leaders at massive corporations, or they're going to go, all sorts of things they're going to go on and do. And the way in which they run those teams, or the way in which they talk to their children, or whatever it might be, is going to in some way be informed by us. The butterfly effect of that is it's impossible that what we do at work has zero impact, right? But the amount of impact is kind of up to us.
And that in some ways reminds me, and Raquel Ficardi is here as well. And that was one of the most recent episodes when she really is the expert on multi-generational issues, and talked about post-pandemic purpose is perhaps the glue for all the generations, where perhaps it was the divide. And I found that fascinating, and with the research that she's done. And that is something now that as a CEO or as a leader in any business, purpose is enormous.
But that was, and I remember that discussion, that was also around this point that it's unique in that it was an event that we all shared together, right? So that was the premise, is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, so many things came out of that, and please, people, check that one out, because the research is available as well via Raquel. But I think for me, and we did some clips we were going to play, but unfortunately we can't play. There's an irony there that we're sat in a cinema, but we will get those clips to you. But one of the interesting things that came out of that conversation was the real need now to be empathetic and step into the shoes of the other generation. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I think I used the term snowflake, and Raquel quite jumped on me very quickly and said, no, I'll stop you there, and strawberries, etc. But actually, she was great in relation to helping me understand just the sheer resilience perhaps of the millennials, but the very different experiences, but also the very different expectations. And then that's difficult, because you're about to get 5 generations in an organization for the first time ever. So for you as a CEO, that's a challenge and an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things I think that is a hot topic right now.
Yeah, and I think the danger is a lot of the conversations you hear about it are people complaining about Gen Z, right? But actually, the challenge is that they also all complain about everybody else. So it's a universal issue, which is the generations are failing to understand each other a little bit.
Yeah, don't ask me the date ranges again because I got them wrong actually in the episode and got so I'm not even going to try and get that. But I just think with all the conversations that I've had, something really fascinating has come out of each and every one, and I'm still just very, very curious in relation to people coming in and talking about what they've learned, and sometimes they've learned things from the most curious of experiences. I'll share one with you. Just strings to mind because we did have a clip of this as well. Stuart Pearce came in. Stuart Pearce, who's the Premier League footballer. He's TalkSport pundit. He was manager of West Ham. I was a little bit frightened actually when he came in because his nickname is Psycho. He doesn't know I actually met Stuart years and years and years ago on the Michael Parkinson show. I was not on the show, but I happened to be there with Michael Parkinson's agent. I remember he came in, and all I remember thinking, wow, his thighs are huge. I just remember that. And so he came into the studio and he was great fun, but I thought, I think this is almost boyhood hero. I've watched him play football so many times and listened to him, as a pundit. And it was really interesting because obviously we got to the topic of Italia 90 and the fact that he missed the penalty and we were put out in the semi-final. But there was a real expectation, by the way, we would have won that tournament. And he's been asked this question lots and lots of times. And actually, his biggest learning went to something completely different. And he told the story that after that desperately disappointing defeat, he got called in for a random drug test and he went to the room where he had to provide that sample. There was another England player who I can't remember and 2 German players. He was in that room for 2 hours and they sat in absolute silence, the German players, out of respect for him, knowing that he was really in a dark place, having just missed a penalty and England being knocked out. And he says one of his lasting lessons and memories was that of the humility of the German players at his lowest ebb. And not only was that really powerful for Stuart, but you might remember in 1996, when actually in the quarterfinals we played Spain and he scored the goal and we put Spain out. And everyone was going crazy and celebrating in the faces of Spain on the pitch, and he didn't. He remembered that lesson, and he remembered now it was his opportunity to be humble in the face of the defeat on Spanish players. And again, I just thought that was a fascinating recollection and powerful lesson off the back of an iconic moment where people just focus on the penalty itself. But it was actually the events that took place afterwards that he really remembers and relishes in many ways.
I think there's a big lesson there about the power of empathy in leadership, right? Which is the ability to sort of pause and look at the people around you and understand how they're feeling.
And I think I'm starting to try and look at what are the components of human-centered leadership. I know Joe Fredericks is here. He's doing a lot of work, his organisation, on human-centered leadership. This was immediately the topic of this conversation, and empathy is one of the components that I'm seeing come out. I'll tell you one other thing that has really struck me from a number of interviews, and that if you are leading in any way, there may be people here in the audience thinking to themselves, well, hang on, I've got no direct reports. But actually you're still leading, because without a shadow of a doubt, you're communicating, inspiring, galvanizing, and leading people over which you have absolutely no direct authority. That goes for you, Tim, as a CEO, and it goes for every single one of us in this room. And I think one of the things that's really, really come out, and it was said to me again by a guest on the show, is that leadership is energy expensive. And I said, what do you mean by that? And I think this goes to the heart of this conversation, is that it's never been more important now for a leader to connect, reconnect, and stay connected with the people that they lead, perhaps even more so than the pandemic. And I saw amazing examples of that. And I'll give you 2 very quick ones. One of them was an incredible leader I met who was Indian-born, Dubai-based, and we met in Atlanta. Go figure, right? And we were there with the ex-com team, the board, and about the top 80. And I knew for a fact that he had run the highest performing factory of about 900 people. And also his employee engagement scores were off the roof. And I had the chance to meet him, and it just happened it was lunchtime, and he actually had a packed lunch. He had a packed lunch with him, which was strange. We were in a hotel. And he said, oh, it's just like back at home. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, every single day my wife makes me a packed lunch, but she makes me a packed lunch enough for 2. And every day I go onto the shop floor and I try and find someone who I don't know or I haven't connected with recently, and I ask if I can share my packed lunch with them. I'm like, wow. I said, how long have you been doing that for? He said, 15 years. 15 years.
That's pretty cool.
And that's what I mean by leadership is energy expensive. And then another very good buddy of mine took a very senior role within the public sector, suddenly had 7,000 people to look after. And I remember going to see him. Yeah, I interviewed him for the book, and he's going to come on the podcast soon. And I remember going to see him in his office, and he had a little A5 black book, and he was very excited about it. And he pulled it off the shelf, and he showed it to me. There's all these coloured Post-it notes sticking out. And I said, "What's this?" He said, "Well, every day I have 15 minutes with somebody within the organisation." He says, the team here try and organise that and just have an open anyone. And I just chat to them, and I just really listen, and I just make some notes to try and understand what it's like to live and work within this organisation. He said, "Because I'm new." I said, "Wow." But this book was full. I said, how long have you been doing this? He said, "I've done it every single day for the 6 months I've been in post." Now, bearing in mind it's a 5-year post, I said, "How long do you do this for?" He said, "Every day for the 5-year post." That I find extraordinary in relation to a leader saying, "This is going to be energy expensive, but I'm up for that." The connection, reconnection, and staying connected to the people that I'm giving a lived experience to. And I just think that's been probably magnified and amplified by the pandemic.
Yeah, 100%. I think I'm very lucky that I kind of can't avoid those conversations. That no matter where I'm walking in town, I sort of pass one of our teams doing some work. So it's cross the road.
You must see them all the time, right, with the Vorboss fans.
So you cross the road, stop, rudely interrupt their work, and have a little chat, which is always good fun. But yeah, it's sort of hard to avoid. But I think it's super important that we recently have grown our senior leadership team, and one of the interesting bits of feedback was one of the new members of the SLT kind of scratching his head and going, "Well, I was kind of surprised that we were talking about a very specific issue with one employee out of 400 in the 2 hours we spend together as the SLT every week. Why, and then actually kind of reflecting and going, but you know what? In no other company I've worked for would that issue have bubbled up that far, that quickly, and been discussed. And my point was, or my feedback on that was, that's kind of what keeps us connected, keeps us close to the coalface, keeps everyone, reminds everyone that at the end of the day, there are hundreds of people working in this organization, and we have to be conscious of that, as well as, dealing with the big strategic issues and the things we would otherwise maybe conceptually think are important.
I think one of the other things that's really jumped out at me is, again, I'm talking post-pandemic. The pandemic was a deeply personal experience for me. It really was, and I anticipate it for everybody. And one of the things that I think also came out was now a need for organizations to be a force for good, to actually do something above just the product or service. How to create a world better led, above and beyond as well, the governments and regimes that we live under. And I think I've been blown away by how much individuals have done when they have no resources. So the resourcefulness off the scale, the resources zero. And I'll give you one example, because as we were preparing for this, I was going back to the episode, I was just thinking, this is just blowing me away in relation to the conversations. I chatted to a guy called Oliver Perkovich, who created something called Skatistan. You might remember this episode. So he goes to Kabul in 2007 with his girlfriend, who has a job out there. And he has no job out there. He's a skateboarder. He takes, I think, 3 skateboards with him. And he thinks, I'll go and I'll check it out, see what happens. Kabul. And let's think, there was a lot of international activity in Kabul at the time. And he goes there, he doesn't really know what to do with himself, so he starts skating, and very quickly he becomes a local attraction because no one has seen skateboarding, especially the children. And he's found an empty fountain, and he's skateboarding in the fountain. He's becoming a bigger and bigger attraction to the kids. And they start to want to skate, and he embraces that. And long story short, between 2007 and 2009, he started Skatistan. And he was trying to get the kids to do this, but trying to also convince them to go to school. So he was paying the kids $1. Well, he had no money at the time, literally $1 to say, can I pay you to help teach other kids, but on the proviso that you also do your schooling as well. Well, long story short, he has a series of bizarre and fortuitous conversations, one with the president of the Olympic Committee, and then with the governments, I think, of Canada, Denmark. So there are others as well, so forgive me for getting that wrong. And he ends up with the largest indoor facility in Afghanistan for skateboarding. Thousands and thousands of kids passing through, 50% which are girls. Because it was
12, indoor, so the girls could do it, right?
So the girls could do it, because you have to separate the boys and the girls after the age of 12. And it was just cutting through the complete socio-economic divide and religious divide. And thousands of children were coming through Skatistan. He's now working on, I think it's something like 850 projects over 100 countries. One bloke with a skateboard.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
It was extraordinary in relation to what he was able to achieve. And he had no resources at all, literally nothing. He didn't have more than 3 skateboards. He literally had to beg, borrow, and steal. And in some ways, as he went home and came back, he brought some more skateboards with him. And then he just convinced people of the benefit of skating in order to cut through the divides. And now it's a global project. And I talk to people like that, and I'm just blown away about how they're able to do that resourcefulness, which is overshadowing the resources, which are zero.
It was a great episode, that one, and worth listening to, because I think it's also the thing I reflected on listening to that episode was he just talks about it like it was a completely normal thing to do.
Yeah,
so
like
it's just
every day, right?
Just like now it's a global movement, and he's like, but yeah, it's yeah.
And I love it. He turned up as well, and there's like all these skateboards behind him, so it's like super cool. And that was a strange part, because there are people in this audience who I am meeting, having had them as guests, but that was during the pandemic. So Camilla's here as well, and you know, we'd never met. And she said, we never met. She goes, I thought you were in America. But we took so many things for granted. We just connected with people over the internet, and we had no idea where everyone was. So that was fascinating as well. And even today, a great reminder, that was a strange time. It really was. But this has been an amazing opportunity to just talk about maybe the rich learning. And I hope we should also mention Gary Ridge. It's one for me. It's one of the standout. That's for me
definitely as well.
We've got to talk about Gary Ridge. Was I think for 26 years was the CEO and chairman of WD-40. We all know WD-40. And I remember chatting to Gary, who is just very, very funny. And I said to him, "Oh God, I know WD-40. That's the iconic can. It's oil in the can." He said, "I'll stop you there." He said, "It's not just oil in the can." He said, "We make memories. It just happens to be oil in the can." And when he said that, I just froze. I thought, "Oh my God, that's so right."
Yeah.
Because one of my earliest memories is me crashing my bike, screwing up the chain, and my dad fixing it and using WD-40. And I thought, you're right. It's about memories.
It's a little red lid.
Oil in a can.
Yeah.
And he has a maniacal focus on culture. So he takes that very, very seriously to the extent, and again, we'll send you the clip. He has something called the Maniac Pledge, where everybody who comes into WD-40 signs the Maniac Pledge because he has a maniacal focus on culture. Well, if you see the statistics, the employee engagement, they're through the roof. And there's a very specific question they ask people, you know, do you love working at WD-40? And it's something like 98% of people love working for the organization. No one is called a manager, everyone is called a coach. So again, for me, it was an example of someone who's taking their leadership and their role at home incredibly seriously and putting huge amounts of effort, not just into the operational running of the business, but how do I in some ways create that lived experience for those around me. And now he's stepped down and he's doing all kinds of
and I think there's hope for us yet, because I feel like the lesson from that is the more boring the product, the more you have to focus on the culture, right? So
oil in the can.
We're going to be fine. But I think what's cool about Gary is you listen to it now, and in some ways it's a great episode, but it's also a touch unremarkable in the modern climate where a lot more people are talking about culture. So many of the things he says resonate with the things that we already do and the things that we're doing. But you have to remember he was doing it way before everybody else.
Yeah.
And I think if you do go and listen to that episode, and I really recommend it, just bear in mind that he was doing this 25 years before people were talking about it.
Yeah.
And he was massively ahead of the curve on that. And I think when you put it in that context, it's super cool because it was just the difficulty of defending that to a board or defending that to your investors at a time when people were really not thinking about the importance of culture.
Check it out because he'll also introduce you to Al, the soul-sucking CEO.
Yeah, it's
which
great.
Is his nemesis in some ways, but he's passionate about positive cultures.
All right. Well, I think we could keep talking for hours, but thank you so much, Adam. I think it's been brilliant. It's been fun to kind of literally put the spotlight on you for a little bit.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's like a stroll down memory lane. So much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. Hopefully you'll see you outside. Join us again next week for more curiosity and insight with the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with me on LinkedIn or visit us at www.leadersenigma.com. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms and on our dedicated YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining the community.